Welcome to the Actor's Voice Conversations with Dan Mitton. Here with John and Russ today. Dan just finished his doctorate in 2020 here with the dissertation Sung Russian for Low Male Voice Classical Singers. He knows all things Russian and voice and diction related. He has a whole host of operatic roles under his belt here, including at the Music Aspen Center, the Britten-Pears Young Artist Program, and a host of others. He's the current vice president of the Ontario chapter of NATS and curates and co-moderates the new forum for professional voice teachers on Facebook. He is a wonderful human being, and we're really thrilled to have him here with us today. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having me.
Our first question here, we always love to start off about your journey. How did you get to where you are? So tell us a little bit about how you got started and what path you took to get from there to Dr. Dan and where you are now.
Yeah, I think like a lot of people, I started singing in church, and that was, you know, the genesis of it. I loved to sing. And then when it came time to go to college, I didn't really have any aspirations. We were not a well-heeled family, so the idea of college was not something that was set up as a goal. But the little liberal arts college in my hometown did have a music program in it, and just on a lark, I kind of went in and sang for it and got accepted. So I spent a couple of years in a religious ring before spring or your money back kind of college, and transferred out of there. I did a summer program when I think I was 20 in Ottawa, and then transferred directly to Ottawa University, did 3 years there, and then transferred from there into the University of Ottawa. So I got a 7-year bachelor's degree, and then finished up there, did a little bit of singing and whatnot after that, did an artist diploma at the conservatory, sang and auditioned from there, and then I took jobs in the real world and worked as a real person and a executive assistant to movers and shakers for a while, which raised a whole nother skill set at the same time as auditioning and trying to make it work as a singer. I finally went back to school late. That's my other life. And returned to grad school in I think I was 39 when I started my master's degree. So that took 2 years back at the University of Toronto. And then I did a contiguous doctorate after that, which was 5 years and change. So about like just on the cusp of taking 8 years. And I'm done. So that, to make a long story short, yeah, it's, humble beginnings and then perseverance and having a spouse who will support you as you follow your joy is pretty great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's great.
So I'm curious about two things in that. And one is that middle section, looking at divergent fields and how are you supporting yourself as an artist, with what income, with what family, as you're trying to pursue your dreams, and how did you try to balance the needs with the wants?
Yeah, that's the question, right? So my particular brand of singer, I'm trained classically, and I actually am a low male voice. So I'm a bass, and basses mature much slower by and large than the other voice types. So while I had colleagues, my soprano colleagues, the soubrettes are out gigging, and I have girlfriends who were working in France at 22. And meanwhile, I just could not for the life of me coordinate. I sort of came into my own marketable voice at 35. So if you're thinking about leaving your bachelor's degree at 20, I mean, for me, after 7 years, I guess I was 24 when I was finished. So between 24 and 35, you've got 11 years of time and growth to fill. And I didn't find, all the right teachers to hasten that development. Now, thankfully, I lucked into a wonderful, Gary Relier is a Canadian bass baritone, and he helped me find my sound. But until I found him, I had to get a job and work. And so I happily went to work for the provincial government and worked as an executive assistant there and learned how to be invisible while powerful people talk, and take notes and be efficient and be the go-to guy for little tech problems in the office, and figure out how to write macros and make people think that you're magic. So, and that's a great bag of skills to bring into, opera and classical music as well, because we've got a lot of folks who are visionary artists without much of a grasp on how to actually make things work. So, it always felt like, because I'd see these other people in young artist programs succeeding and doing their art and going off here and doing these things, and me facing the reality that my technical kit bag was not together, and I had a job doing, work elsewhere, and you do worry about imposter syndrome. You do worry about whether your commitment is equal to that of your peers who look more successful. But at the end of the day, I don't regret it at all, and I'm grateful for those experiences. It's just not the direct line that a lot of people wish they had.
True story.
I think that's great. The kind of slow burn to career is something that we don't hear enough about for young singers, because in so many areas and in so many fields, we're this kind of pipeline and rush to career, and it just doesn't work for all voices, for all singers, certainly not for all artists, because you have to find your direction, and sometimes you just have to wait till you mature into your instrument,
Not to mention how many of us there are. I mean, there are so many smart, talented, driven people, and so few opportunities for those people to slot into. So the overflow has to go somewhere, and picking up some real world skills isn't a bad option.
And that actually segues to the other point that I wanted to draw out of that story that you have, which is how do you find those marketable skills that you developed over those years, having your day job, supporting yourself? How is that now translating to what you're doing now?
That's an interesting question. It's just I'm thinking about an aside. It was a real culture shock to come back to school after having been out in the private and public sector, just because I remember just the sheer incompetence of some administrative staff, and thinking like, man, you'd totally be fired if you worked at the company that I just came from. Like, and I remember being really angry about that, because not only was there a skill disparity, but there was just a personality barrier too for student facing or public facing people. And I was always shocked at that. But that's a total aside. You asked about how the skill set applies to the work that I'm doing now.
Yeah.
So if you're writing a dissertation, you're basically being your own secretary and editor. So your writing skills are, on, high firing mode, and and just critical thinking on your feet helps you navigate, the bureaucracy of the university while you're sort of winding through a doctoral process. Right now, so having taken on the position of vice president for NATS, it's a service organization, and it too draws on a lot of the skills that I learned in my other life, because there are meetings. And I remember, one of the jobs that I had, one of the temp jobs I had, was at the College of Occupational Therapists of Ontario. And they held all of their meetings strictly following Robert's Rules of Order, which I'm happy to never come into contact with again, except that I discovered that NATS Ontario has this wonderful legacy emeritus member who makes sure that we follow basically what amounts to Robert's Rules. So it's not a foreign thing to me. I recognize that, So it's been nice to sort of have a cordial wave at old experiences in the real world. Everything old is new again, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's really interesting. Dan, just for anyone who might be watching that doesn't know, NATS, National Association of Teachers of Singing, you're vice president
Yep.
of the Ontario kind of regional, or?
Yeah, they say the Ontario chapter. Yeah.
Ontario chapter. Fantastic. Yeah. And most of the teaching you're doing right now is private studio. Are you connected to any universities right now?
independent studio practitioner, and the surprising thing to me, so my brand, I think, is, and my scholarship and my experience is about low male voice development. And so a fair amount of my students come to me from maybe interviews like this that they've seen of me online. There are a few of them out there where I hope I don't look too terrible. But they reach out through those points of contact, and so my studio, it's just the silver lining maybe of the pandemic that we're going through right now, is that everybody's moved online, and so my studio expands. You know, I have Canadian students, but I also have students in the U.S. and I have students in Europe who reach out to get my opinion on what they're singing and how to sing better. That's a surprise to me. I always expected that my studio would look like the standard, come in, stand next to the piano, blah, blah, blah. But I actually really like the online model. There are advantages to bringing this work online. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I'm finding online is really helping me in my focus as an instructor, what I'm looking for and how I want to say it. Because I'm wildly ADHD. It's off the charts. And so when I've got somebody in person, there's 75 things that I want to do. And I found that being online has really helped me focus on what we're going to talk about. And the results that I've been getting online versus in person have been profoundly better. It's a wonderful thing.
I love hearing that. There's a lucky confluence between what you're saying, and a colleague of mine the other day released a little vid about basically bringing some of the things we're learning through motor learning into the online paradigm, just like very simple directives and 3 to 5 repetitions of an exercise uninterrupted without feedback, and then posing insights as questions. Those 3 things as a guideline are so useful in an online paradigm. I mean, they're useful in person, but in an online paradigm where everything just feels densely packed for time, those are great ways to infuse every second with value.
Absolutely.
I think that's really neat. Online has been an interesting, kind of journey for me as well. I certainly miss being face-to-face in the studio with students, but the online, there are things from online that I've noticed about my teaching that I can bring back to in-person lessons and vice versa, So one of them for me is, especially with musical theater singers, which I work with a lot, is not leaning on the keyboard. They've had to work their ear training in a way that no one has ever made them work their ear training before.
Right.
Because they're used to singing with a pianist or with a track all the time. And, with the limitations of some of our teleconferencing software, I can't play for them the way that I would in studio.
There are, a colleague of ours, in our brief conversation before the interview, we were talking about a colleague who's investigating low latency solutions. And I think we're really on the cusp of an affordable solution that's going to actually cut down that lag as long as your student is within a certain geographic area.
Yeah, I read some of that stuff and it's fascinating, but I think what I'll take away from this as an instructor is even though maybe I can play again, I don't think I will as much as I have before.
I missed the 360 of the student. And in our brief conversation, you were saying, as somebody who's migrated from classical into music theater and into other styles, I wonder if you notice a stylistic sort of litmus between, I find it easier to coach my singer-songwriters online, and my classical singers, I always worry about sound fidelity, which is where our colleagues' research is going to come in handy because there's a high fidelity component to that, but also being able to look at their bodies in space. And sometimes it's, a directive for, my tenor who's, all strung up is, can you unlock your knees? Yeah. And you can't see that if you're not looking for it online, right? So it takes away some of the magic and spontaneity of having that perfect thing to say, because you can't really actually absorb the whole student online.
Where are you hiding your attention gets harder when it's in their knees.
Right. But you can, it's the Dumbo's feather, right? It's misdirection. It's basically anywhere else that you can think of, because everything's locked. And so if you bring their attention to anything, it's going to work.
Right on.
Yeah.
So I hate to interject here. My ADHD mind must have missed that Zoom is no longer free and you have to sign up if you have multiple members. I never saw that message, so I'm getting a pop-up. We've got about 7 minutes remaining. So if we get kicked off,
Okay.
I'll send out a new invite and we'll just start from where we were. If we don't get kicked off, it'll just be a strange occurrence that there's this thing flashing on my screen.
Surprise.
Yeah.
And that's all right. We can always splice it together. That's
right.
Very interesting, John. I didn't know that either, but
I think there's a 40-minute limit. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they had waived that for the longest time. That was not active during the pandemic, I guess, until now.
I'm glad you're finding out now with us.
And not during a lesson. Yeah.
Probably during a lesson. Exactly.
Yeah. Although that would have been one-on-ones, or there wouldn't be a limit. It's usually, as I understood it, it was a limit on more than two persons in a room.
Right.
So, but good to know.
Good to know. Well, with all that fun, now that I've ruined the momentum of what was a wonderful conversation,
it's encouragement for me to have those short directives I was talking about.
I'm curious. Total aside of what our the conversation here really is geared for, but you say you have international students, and I'm wondering, what is the latency like as you're working internationally, and how have you found working from that distance?
Yeah, there's latency. So. You get into so at the beginning of the pandemic, the advice that our teachers were giving through the forum that I co-moderate was about sign language, right? So that's stop, that's up by semitone, like that kind of thing. You work that out. And in that way, you can have an antiphonal exchange with your student with the understanding that you can't play them through scales. So you wind up doing it. It's like you were talking about, Russ, those ear training skills really come in handy. So you play a pattern and expect them to execute it over and over again. And especially if you're expecting them to do 3 to 5 repetitions without you intervening, you really need them to know what to sing, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there definitely, like with my student in Germany, there is lag. I mean, it's appreciably, I haven't mapped it, but it's, the speed of light travels at like X per second, and in the practical sense, it might feel like maybe a 3/4 or a second, but you can always find a way to work around it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
That's interesting.
What drew you to the field? Why did you want to go into singing, and why did you want to go into voice teaching?
Okay. So singing is an easy thing. I was an expressive little gay kid. So that's, it seems like it's our birthright to sing. And when I understood that you could get paid to do that, I was like, sign me up. So that's easy. The switch to teaching, almost, it's funny, it did feel like another coming out process almost to myself, because I saw a lot of my colleagues in performance. I mean, we all went through, like even my doctorate is in performance with a specialization in voice pedagogy. So artist diploma from a conservatory for performance, bachelor of music in performance, and all this drive to perform. I was seeing my colleagues go through these steps, and they were living out of suitcases, and they were having relationships disintegrate or not able to form lasting relationships outside of a caste, whatever caste they were in at the time. And that's not me. My husband and I have been together for 24 years, I guess, 25. It's been a minute anyway. And we're keepers, we're lifers that way. And, my two drives in this whole world are to love my family and to make good art. And I thought that I was going to have to compromise on the family aspect of it to make good art. But it turns out I was really inspired by reading Stephen Smith, the guy who wrote The Naked Voice. He writes a little bit in his foreword to his book about making a conscious choice to focus on teaching. And there's a great line of great teachers who've done that too. I think about Garcia, who had, a failed singing career at 23 or 24, and then he turned to a lifelong teacher and did that until his 90s, right? I thought, and I'm not saying I'm Garcia or Steve Smith, but they are luminaries in the sense that these are not only viable, but expert teachers with a long list of successful students that they have it undeniably helped sing better, who did not prioritize their own performance, And I saw, Steve Smith, when he was here as one of the clinicians for the Nats intern program, he sang a recital. I mean, it's not like you don't get to sing if you choose to be a teacher. It's just you don't plan to pay your mortgage that way. And so I don't plan to pay my mortgage as a performer necessarily. It doesn't mean that I won't take on another project. And as a matter of fact, last year I had a friend of mine who just passed, actually. He wrote a song cycle for me, and I was able to perform that. So to sing good contemporary Canadian music written for low male voice, I'm always going to jump at that, at the chance to do that. But I'm happy. I'm happy about finally arriving at home as a teacher intentionally.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And it makes so much sense. I mean, that just parallels a lot of things that I've experienced, certainly, because I was I started off in music education, and when all of my friends were going into the classroom, I decided I didn't want to, and went into performance.
Oh, wow.
I finished up my bachelor's degree in music education and was like, no, I'm not ready to go into the classroom. So I went to a master's in vocal performance, which is where John and I met at Bowling Green State. But even in all my time at Bowling Green, I was on this fence. Am I going to sing? What am I going to do? How's that going to look? I was dating someone long term, and then became engaged to my wife. I'm married halfway through a master's degree, and had to make those choices. Am I gonna pack up a suitcase and leave, or am I gonna do something different? And when I started teaching, I developed a love for it that I didn't necessarily expect to, but I started teaching in a different capacity, and there's a richness there. You develop this affinity for it and say, you know what, this is another way to make art.
I have to agree 100%. I mean, you're not, who are you convincing? One of the funny bits about teaching from a home studio is that my husband actually sees me after I teach lessons, and he often comments how energized
we were
I feel.
having a wonderful conversation about you teaching and the energy that it brings you, the energy that it gives you.
Well, or so my husband says. I mean, I still feel like me. No, it really does. It really does. I just love it. And look, I liked performance, but I never liked the lead up to performance. And as performers yourselves, there's that space of, the hour before, or the time that you're in the hall waiting to go on stage. I hate that so much. So to trade that off for, and I love actually performing. And it's to the point where I think for my final doctoral recital, I arrived in the hall like 5 minutes before I went on stage, just because I hate just sitting around and being idle, right? But by contrast, when a student comes and you're able to share with them how to use their voice in a more coordinated way, or you're able to get them. I read a post today from a member from our forum where she was able to coach her undergrad into the right way to say in German. And I'm like, because I also moderated a forum for lyric diction, and I could just feel the vicarious cheering of our colleagues for that. It's a thrill. It's a thrill to help somebody make good art. Yeah,
absolutely. And have you found that as you're diving deeper into how to teach well, what sort of things you're looking for in your students, are you finding that has an impact on you as an artist?
Well, yes. I had a high schooler who I just adore, and I was so happy this past year. All of my students who applied to music schools to get in, they were all accepted, and
Congrats.
he was one of my guys, and I spent the year preparing him, and midway through that, it was time to mount the song cycle that had been created for me by my friend. And so the parent of my student, was excited about it, and she wanted to come and attend, and I was happy to have her there. But then I thought, man, I better put my money where I better sound good. So there's a pressure element, right? Because you want to sing the sing, you want to walk the walk, and that's definitely present. I'm not sure, I don't know what anyone else's technical journey is like, but once I understood how to coordinate my voice, it just sort of feels like it's like, like that's how you throw a softball. Like you understand how to. Okay, that's the voice I sing with. Like yeah. So I can't. I'm sure it does affect it, but I'm not thinking critically from a pedagogical sense when I'm got my performance hat on.
Okay.
I could be alone. The other people maybe will rave about it, or would straight up say to me, "No, I've seen you, and this definitely makes a difference." So, maybe.
No, I think that I asked because my journey as an artist and as a singer, as a not as low voice male, baritone / basso cantante, also delayed. I was singing tenor when I was singing with Russ. It was fun. And my journey as a teacher and my journey as an artist kind of went hand in hand. And I was teaching at the college level in 2007. I was in my doctorate, and at that time still a little confused about what my voice was, and it took me a really long time after that. And I was watching what are my teachers saying, and what am I discovering in the studio that I'm telling my own students. And I was finding this feedback loop between what I was telling my students and what I was neglecting in my own study. And so that's the genesis of the question.
I wish I had said that. That sounds great.
Too kind.
Yeah, and I think it's for me, John. It's sometimes it's a reminder for sure. I kind of have what I know my voice feels like to me, which I think is akin to what Dan was saying. This is my voice. This is how I'm using it. When I'm not using it correctly, I notice how it feels. I'm not necessarily thinking about all of the pedagogical details. But when I find myself telling my students about these pedagogical details, about what they need to be attending to, what they need to be finding, and how do they discover that in their own voice, I've found myself saying, wow, I'm not doing that right now the way I should be, or wow, I should pay attention to that next time I'm singing whatever. And it's just interesting because I also find myself telling them things that I wish someone had told me early on. Like, oh yeah, you're listening to that person, but they're not you. Don't try to do that. And as you find your voice, or as you help someone else find theirs, it reminds you at the very least of what it was like to find yours.
Well, Russ, you're saying something important about tonal goals, and I saw a clip today. There's a gentleman who does gospel quartet, like barbershop quartet kind of stuff. He's a low male voice, and he was interviewing other basses from gospel quartets, asking them for their one bit of advice. And it was interesting because one of them said, oh, go listen to so-and-so and try to sound just like him. And my pedagogical, that's not a good strategy. I mean, you can inherit a whole firestorm of problems. But at the same time, when that was told to me as a student, I took that to mean don't listen to good singing. And that's terrible too. You need to listen to how the art form is carried out. Can you imagine being a music theater student and not understanding the conventions between Emile and Jean Valjean? Like I don't like, they're different, right? Like, and you need to hear it on its legs. It doesn't come off the page to you. So it's a catch-22. You don't want to imitate anybody necessarily, but then again, you don't want to be devoid of the stylistic necessities.
Right. I feel like my answer to that with my students is always to say, I don't want you to mimic anyone, but I want you to listen to everyone. And
I love that.
I try to give them, the span of colors and options of what a voice that's similar to yours, but isn't yours, might sound like. And I don't know what you're going to sound like in 5 years. I know what you sound like right now. I want you to listen to all of these people. And let's talk about what good singing sounds like, what great artistry looks like. and then we'll find out how you do that with your voice. You know?
I love that. And I think it's also an interesting experiment to listen to dissimilar voices. And we see this a lot of, I just happen to be thinking about music theater right now. I saw that there's that song, Never Enough from The Greatest Showman. And on YouTube right now, you can see that song sung by, you know, men and women and gender indeterminate people of varying voice types, and how they cope with the technical demands of that song are really interesting, because some folks just have their voices sit in a place that's sympathetic to it. Other folks have to work for it, but they succeed. And so becoming sensitive to those technical adjustments is a big education for a singer.
It's amazing.
Yeah,
absolutely. Let's talk about some of those technical adjustments, particularly for young singers or younger singers. So we're not talking like 6-year-olds, but let's talk, you know, high school, college, the emerging professional maybe. What do you see in your studio that are perhaps deficiencies that are regularly occurring with singers coming in? What do you have to work on with people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I'm going to give a low male voice specific answer first, and then a general answer. So the specific answer is that low male voices have short tops, and it's not uncommon for a little low male voice bassling to come into my studio and barely be able to phonate above middle C. Like that's a real possibility. And that's normal. It's normal. And you work on it, and we do falsetto exercises, and there's remedies for that. And you're not alone, and I know how to help you. For students in general, and I see this actually across the board, underpinning your phonation with meaning is the big necessity. Like, it's not, the world is full, I feel, of singers who are willing to make pretty sounds that are unconnected and uncoordinated, but they're pretty, and that's fine. And I don't have time for that. I find my work, especially with my singer-songwriters, but also with my classical singers, I want them to underpin their singing with some emotional motivation. It has to come from the text. It has to come from how you feel about things. It can come from what you ate for dinner if you feel passionately enough about it. But just opening your mouth and singing me a 5-note scale is not useful. Sing me that 5-note scale, but have it motivated by grief, have it motivated by heartbreak, have it motivated by desire. Put something underneath. Give me a subtext. I find that a lot of our young singers don't understand how necessary. It's not extra. This isn't frosting on the cake. This is the cake.
Yeah. And it's interesting because something that seems on the surface to be, not a technical thing, it changes what these students are doing technically. I think that's fascinating.
My suspicion that I'm working on, and maybe you guys will have an insight in this, but I suspect that a lot of technical problems can be resolved with the right emotional motivation. If you're coming from the right place, I believe that it shorthands our bodies into, all of a sudden it's then you're there's just a way that our body coordinates when we're when we're convincingly integrated emotionally, that you don't have to arrive at it by pulling all the levers and pushing the right buttons. It's organic. And to my mind, organic singing and motivated singing like that is what puts me on the edge of my seat as a spectator. I don't think I'm alone.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. We don't listen to someone because it's a nice sound. We listen because it moves us.
Because it moves us, exactly. And so if it's going to move you, you have to be speaking from a place that you're convinced you're feeling yourself and you're in it, and you're going to give rise to vocalism that reflects that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I heard Ken Bozeman talking about this a year ago. He's amazing, right?
Yeah.
I was at Ian Howell's vocal acoustics with Ken and Chadley a year ago.
That would be 2 years ago.
2 years ago. That's right. 2 years ago now. That's right.
I went last year.
You went last year.
Yes, and I'll go this year. Yeah.
And watching him talk about how we need to sometimes remind our body of what it can do, but it knows what to do, it knows how to do it, and it's got to have that motivation beforehand. And that's such a missing link for so many singers, because we worry about what's the sound, and that's not the point.
Well, I love that you're saying it's a missing link, because I do believe that a lot of working singers out there actually do pull the right levers and push the right buttons in sequence because they're brilliant and they can remember to do a trillion steps. I prefer it to be a more organic, athletic thing, So I agree with you. Things work better to my taste with an emotional affect, but I also think our industry is full of people who either have never been exposed to that possibility or who've shied away from it and worked out incredible genius workarounds that would exhaust me.
Yeah.
It's an interesting notion, and I think it's a divide too in the way that different singers train for different genres. We talk about this a lot. On the classical side, we have a tendency to get really steeped in pedagogy, and sometimes it becomes, what did you call it, Dan? Levers and buttons, and we forget to connect emotionally. Whereas sometimes I work with theater singers who are coming out of a theater aesthetic and a theater training, where they're looking for a subtext and they're looking for an emotional, connection to what they're singing, but maybe they need a little bit of a technical tweak, and then to connect that back to that emotion in some way.
I'm not dissing technical tweaks. I want to be clear about that.
Certainly not.
And when we work technique, that's great. It's just, I have to admit, one of this is going to, I hope this reads authentic, because I mean it in context of our conversation. But my teacher in my master's and doctorate once wrote a letter of recommendation for me. And she said that, Dan is one of the rare singers I've ever come across who simply can't phonate without an emotional impulse, an emotional underpinning. And when I read that when she wrote it, and it reads like a terrific compliment, but it floored me, because I thought, isn't the world looking for that? And so I'm surprised when I meet these technical magicians who can do it from another place, because I can't think that fast. I can't live that fast.
Yeah,
that's my world, man. That's how I developed. The inability to understand and process emotions as an individual prevented me from being able to process and show them as an artist. And so I had to learn how to pull those levers and push those buttons to make the sounds that were right for the industry. And it wasn't until later, and after the kind of the quote unquote height of my performance career was over, that I actually figured out how to be a whole human being.
I want to hear about that, John.
I do too.
How did that arrive? Was that an epiphany for you, or was it the end of a long process, or how did that moment present itself, or was it a moment, or was it a chunk of time? How did you arrive at that?
Ever evolving process, so starting off with, looking back at who I was as a child, and where did I grow up, and how did I grow up as, the repressed Dutch CRC child in the bubble that I was, watching, the senior recital, the capstone of my 4 years of a music degree as an undergraduate, and singing Die Liebe and Ich kralle nicht und wenn das Herz auch and there's just nothing, and it's all just, okay, what's got to happen? We probably all seen the comic of, the sopranos thinking about the high note, or the tenor's thinking about the high note, and the soprano's thinking about the tenor, and the mezzo's, doing something else, and the baritone's
bass is thinking about fishing.
Right.
Right.
And that was always me. I always fancied myself the technician, because that's how I had to translate music.
You had to. It was necessary for how you understood your voice.
Yeah.
So what about the moment when you finally sort of embraced your own athleticism, or your own coordination? How did that arrive?
Several moments that kind of culminated in that. One of them that I can say was kind of a seminal moment. I was singing Tarquinius in The Rape of Lucretia. And
that's such a great aria. That aria, I love it.
I loved that. That was that was one of my five for a long time.
If I come back as a baritone, I'll come back to sing that aria.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But trying to sing that role, I'd gotten away with, actually my first role and first role that I did with Russ, I was singing Alma Viva in Marriage of Figaro, and I got away with just not acting in that, because I was 6.5 feet tall, and I could make the right sounds at the right time, and it was fine, and everybody else could do their comic thing around me, and I didn't have to carry the show. But then coming to something like a Tarquinius, where you can't come to that moment and just make the sounds.
You have to be authentic. Can you imagine doing that from a, how did that?
Just doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
Well, it can't. Yeah.
No, and it was traumatic to go through that as an artist, and on the heels of that was also I was diving into some Mahler, and I did Kindertotenlieder, and you can't do that from a place of pulling the levers and pushing the buttons. And
were you on your own, or did you have a teacher that you could sort of rely on at that time?
Gray area. So this is in my doctorate. I had 2 years with a wonderful man, Larry Weller, who was at University of Minnesota. He retired after my 2 years. I took a year off, was teaching full time elsewhere, and then came back and had a new teacher, Philip Zavisha, who's a wonderful human being, great voice. But we hadn't yet had time to really work together as we were going through that. So I won't say that I was on my own, because there were people there, but I was pretty busy. I was pretty hectic. And I wasn't utilizing them in a way that I probably should have. So I kind of felt like I was on an island.
Well, I mean, it is a personal journey to start with. Like your teacher can't teach you anything. They can just help you figure yourself out,
Mm-hmm.
But I'm really interested about you coming, in from one side and then understanding that you're not connected, and then emerging out the other and going, oh man, this is what people do.
Yeah. It's crazy. And it's why I love working with my MT students and my CCM students, because they're all coming from this place of, almost uniformly, they're all coming from a place of, I have to express something, I have to emote something. They don't necessarily know how to do that most effectively and most efficiently. So I can take my technical background and kind of tweak things a little bit, but they already have the drive, they already have the motivation. That's so wonderful to see.
That is a blessing to have a student arrive with that sense of, I have a voice, I have something to say.
Yeah.
I love it. I'm jealous.
Yeah,
it's great.
Yeah. It's a lot of fun.
And when they don't come, with that drive, finding a way to get them to speak their truth with their voice and be authentic, that's almost a harder journey sometimes than getting them to connect the breath with the phonation.
Yeah, well, you get the blinks, right? You try to explain to one of these kids, like, you're 16 and you're perfectly normal developmentally, but you're trying to explain to this kid, your birthright is expressivity. You have a right to sing. You have a voice, and then it's a big moment to get those fledgling sounds, and you'll get one or two per song sometimes, and you'll be like, yeah, that did you feel that? And it's that's its own pleasure.
Yeah. No, it's the, I don't know how to act, where you go, but you don't have to act necessarily. You just have to be motivated. Yeah. We could talk about this all day. This is wonderful.
Absolutely.
So Dan, was there a time as you were developing that really was a seminal moment, figuring out how your voice worked and what it really could be and the beauty that it is?
Oh, wow. That's a great loaded question. Fantastic. Again, I keep coming back to the normalcy of the uncoordinatedness of the low male voice. We develop later, and it's normal for us to not have anything together at the same time as our peers, just chronologically. So for me, it took a long time to develop. And I went through a string of teachers who, could help with basic musicianship, or could help with, helping me through repertoire, or who were but were non-specific to low male voice development. And in my 30s, I lucked into lessons with Gary Relier, who is a Canadian bass baritone. He's just wonderful. And he had me make barnyard animal noises for about a year, because I had that whole light poppy kind of kind of thing, the disconnected, musical in tune but not connected. And I that not connected would come back, and I'm like, connected to what? It's my voice, right? But instead of under energized, he wanted and so to learn how to do that came to me from doing a lot of trying to learn how to be relaxed and resonant, bent over at the waist and sounding like a cow, and doing a lot of, believe it or not, vocal fry. One of the, I think that low male voices in particular respond to full fold contact. So doing vocal fry will help a low male voice come into that groundedness in a way that other voice types need to worry about fine fold coordination. And I think we all do, even low male voice needs to fool around with falsetto and work that down into the sound is great. But we also need a sense of in the sound. So we don't want we want the idea of working its way through. So you get it gives you that M1 or that chest or that modal, whatever you need to call it. And Gary was the one who helped me understand that was not hollering or forcing or pressing. It was appropriate, and it was my right to make that noise. Which I don't think of, it's funny, I don't think of it as beautiful, but I do think of it as authentic. So in the Keatsian way, that probably stands for it, I don't know, but giving up the idea of making a beautiful noise liberated me. Now, I know that's not everybody's hang up, but for me, being preoccupied about having a beautiful voice stopped me from coming into my own power vocally.
That's interesting.
Love that. Yeah. Absolutely love that. That's actually one of the reasons why I was singing tenor for a while, is all of my teachers were working M2, we're working fine coordination, and nobody was willing to I did no fry, I did no growl, and I lost my bottom. And I went in my master's degree.
I wonder why.
Right? It's like I couldn't phonate on a low A, and there's no reason why I don't have access to a low C now.
Right?
It's interesting because those demands it's important across, like you said, for all voice types, but particularly for lower voices. I've never been a low voice. Someone thought I was a baritone for a week and then realized that happened. But you still have to understand like those levels of closure. What's that feel like to make that sound?
Mm-hmm. And what's appropriate, right? Like it's about appropriate. You don't. Yeah. Yes.
I agree. Oh, it's great.
Where are we? I don't even know where we are in our questions anymore.
Well, you got a couple more you wanted to hit at the end.
We're all over the place. Yeah.
Yep, that's all right. Stuff.
I actually did want to go into, because we're talking with a great pedagogue here, what are kind of your go-to? What are some methodologies? What are some strategies you regularly find yourself using with students?
Yeah. Okay. So those are a couple of different. So something that really, we're very lucky at the University of Toronto to have a very good pedagogy program there that is intensive, and it's based on in-lesson observations of like the entire faculty, and you get exposed to a lot of different approaches. But one of the things that I read, because I'm an avid reader of pedagogy texts, was the work of Cornelius Reed, believe it or not. He's an American voice teacher who was a student of Douglas Stanley, I guess. But Reed wrote he has a trilogy of books that starts with, I guess Psyche and Soma is the third one, right? What is it? First one is Bel Canto. The second one is something about 1950, 1965, 1975, something like that. Anyway, he writes about the triangle of pitch, vowel, and intensity. And for me, that shorthands the tools that we have to work with in the studio. So when I'm teaching, and I need to devise an insight or a corrective suggestion to my student, I tend to think in terms of altering either the pitch or the vowel or the intensity. Just pick one of those and play around with that. And so Reed's framework for me sort of guides how I intervene. Is there any specific thing that works? Approaches vary with the student. I'm sort of sad to say and glad to say that I don't have a system worked out. I speak to colleagues in the UK, who I love and admire, who work under a certain method, and I think how convenient that must be. But it's my understanding that voice pedagogy education in North America doesn't, unless you're, buying one of these proprietary brands, our university educations don't really, that we're more of a smorgasbord approach. And so Reed features heavily in mine, but I mentioned Steve Smith before. I mean, his book is like nothing I'd seen in the pedagogy literature. The way he frames the idea of inventions, masterful. But even Vennard, is ahead of his time. Coffin, so ahead of his time. And here I'm, I just feel like I'm just rhyming off names for my right? It all goes in the pot. It all helps. In terms of primal sounds, like the barnyard noises I was talking to you about, I mean, Janice Chapman has some marvelous stuff to talk about in her book. I love David Jones's work. All these luminaries writing in a way that is so insightful and so helpful, but you have to put it on its feet. So our studios wind up being a little bit of an alchemical lab in that sense, where you're trying out. I mean, like, I always have an idea of what to do, but something will flash into your head from something you read in McKinney, and then you'll try that, and that's flop, doesn't work. Okay, well, Miller says this. Let's try, and all of that has to be an inner talk, because you don't want to expose your students to that. So it's it's just satisfying. I'm sorry I'm getting carried away in a tangent, but it's something I really love.
Oh, it's neat. Yeah, I love you taking the best of all of these readings and all of these people.
Yeah, don't you?
Who all had wonderful ideas. And no one of them has the recipe for success, or wouldn't have all these books, right?
Well, here's a philosophical thing, though, that I think what we have to offer teaching, because this information is not new. We've been doing this for 400 years now, right? I didn't invent this stuff, and neither did you guys. So what we have to offer in June of 2020, which is when this is being recorded, is our curation of this material. And I think that's why people come to see us. I think we've all seen studios that are sustained by the cult of personality. And I've never been that guy. I don't want to be that guy. I have been through those guys as a student, and that's not for me. But if somebody's coming to see me, I think they're coming to see me for my curation of what I've picked up about low male voice development, or about breath control, or about emotional motivation. My curation is what I have to sell. And that is mostly other people's information, but the alchemy is that I pick the bits that I want to expose you to and have you run through. And I just like you two do, people will buy what you're selling because you're selling it.
Absolutely. I love that.
That's great.
We are running short on time in this session as well. So I'm going to move on to our last question, which winds up being, almost last question. What advice do you have for our young singers, for our young performers who are just starting off in this?
And we're so used to hearing, if you can do anything else, go do that. Come on, I think I've said a couple of times in our conversation tonight that singing is our birthright, and it is. Human beings are creative people, and if you feel led to make music with your voice, you should do it. I'm not gonna. What advice would I have? My advice that I would have and honestly, this is gonna sound maybe Pollyanna, but be kind. And the reason I say be kind is that this industry, this discipline even, is built on relationships. And so if you're unkind to a colleague who doesn't have a high X and isn't well coordinated, but is in your leader class and is seeing you every week, and you're nasty to them as an undergraduate, they will never forget. And they may be a casting director that you need access to, or somebody who could tell you about a gig, or just a good colleague who works their crap out in a master's degree, So the idea of assigning personal worth through vocal acumen is dead. That is not a good way to decide who's a worthwhile human being. Be kind, form relationships, and be willing to just get over yourself and link, connect with people. That's so important. I would say also, don't isolate yourself in a practice room. We're not pianists who can lock themselves up for 6 hours a day anyway. Singers, we've got, I get an undergraduate might have an hour and a half a day max. I mean, even 10-minute sessions spaced between, like, out through the day is appropriate in my opinion. But you need to go out and live. You need to read books. You need to fall in love. You need to have your heart broken. You need to work a day job. You need to listen to all kinds of and different styles of music. You need to be exposed. You need to go see dance. You need to go to music theater, go to an opera, be style agnostic. Don't spend all your time in a practice room, because that emotional motivation stuff I was talking about, that doesn't emerge from a vacuum. You have to have lived in order to be authentic. So that's my advice. And I know it's not, career singing like this is how you generate a high G flat, but honestly, you need to be a human being before you're anything else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic.
Yeah. That's great.
Cool.
How can people find you, Dan?
You can go to danmitton.com, and my first name is spelled with 2 N's, so it's www.dannmitton.com.